today I decided I wanted to do a blog on something I've been thinking about for a while, which is Shakespeare. Uh, I recently moved, and just before I moved, I went to see the movie All Is True, which was a fictionalized film about the last 3 years of Shakespeare's life, written by Ben Elton, directed by Kenneth Branagh. I'm a huge Kenneth Branagh fan, and I thought Branagh's performance as Shakespeare was really good. The writing sometimes frustrated me a bit because they had Shakespeare be much more a product of his time about women, or at least a product of what Ben Elton and Kenneth Branagh think about the time, that women were explicitly considered only property and only valuable insofar as they produced male heirs. Although there is a lot of affection and genuine love between Shakespeare and his wife and his daughters, he unthinkingly treats them like just secondary. And the man who wrote Rosalind from As You Like It, and Viola from Twelfth Night, and Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing, that man seems like he would not have that kind of attitude towards his own daughters and his wife. So that felt a little untrue, a little bit of a lazy shorthand. Now, I understand what they were doing was they were trying to build an arc, because Shakespeare is very estranged. He comes back in the last 3 years of his life. His daughters are grown in their late 20s, early 30s, very unhappy, and his attitude towards them is viewed as part of why they're unhappy. So the movie builds an arc where he comes to love them more appropriately and respect them and understand their talents and skills. And so there's a rapprochement at the end where they reconcile, and there's a really lovely scene where his wife, who is illiterate, begins to learn how to read and write, which is very powerful to the man who wrote some of the best works of the English language. However, it just feels a bit forced. Elton also has the problem as a screenwriter that he decides to end a lot of scenes in the same way, which gives it sort of repetitive feeling structure. Branagh's direction's quite good, instead of a lot of the flashy camera work that he loved in his early Shakespeare adaptations. He really goes for a very quiet and almost static sense of the frame. He really builds to beautiful images and a sense of stillness and regret, and also peace and contentment, which is really, really nice. Patrick Doyle, of course, does the music, and it's very unobtrusive this time. Ian McKellen plays a noble, the famous noble for whom Shakespeare wrote the sonnets, and it's explicitly stated that Shakespeare was in love with this nobleman, and his wife is very upset about this, and Shakespeare sort of makes a play for that love again, but Ian McKellen's nobleman rejects him and says, "You're a commoner. You should be proud of your genius, but I could never have a relationship with you." This is a fairly common scholarly contention about the sonnets, I believe. And so while I think it doesn't make sense based on my reading of the sonnets, I wasn't super surprised. So that started my sort of reinvigoration of my love of Shakespeare, and I've loved Shakespeare since I was in my late teens, and I first saw Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, which I just rewatched this time through. It's been a long time since I rewatched Hamlet. I actually had to buy a new copy because my discs were scratched right at the climax of the duel, which is a terrible place to have a scratch. And I found both that I intensely love this adaptation because Kenneth Branagh's character of Hamlet is intensely loyal and intelligent, but he's also very over the top in a way that's very uninteresting. During the play within a play scene, he jumps on stage and has to make everything about him, and it's really obnoxious. Same with the mad scene when he meets the ghost. His performance just isn't, it doesn't engage me emotionally or make me think the same way that his quiet moments do. His quiet moments, like seeing Claudius praying and almost killing him, or when the very first time he meets Horatio, he turns away from Horatio to the camera, sort of expecting that more people are going to bother him, and he's like, I wish you well. And then he realizes it's Horatio, and he says, Horatio, or I do forget myself. He turns around, and there's this light in his eyes, and it's just so beautiful. I just love that depiction of his friendship with Horatio, who's played by Nicholas Farrell, who is another great actor. And so the Hamlet was really good. I still don't really like Kate Winslet as Ophelia, which brings me to a film I actually watched before that, which was Ophelia, starring Daisy Ridley from Star Wars. And I'm glad I went to this film without doing a lot of research. I didn't read the novel. I checked out the novel. I know sort of the plot of the young adult novel, but I didn't read it all the way through, and I didn't read a lot of interviews or listen to a lot of interviews, which I have done since then, and I'm glad I didn't before seeing it, because the director and the novelist who wrote the original story both tried to connect Ophelia to current political events, and I think some of those things are worthwhile, but I think others of them are just really ill thought through. I mean, the director said something about how Shakespeare is a sexist play. Hamlet is a sexist play, and I think that you're confusing what Hamlet says, frailty thy name is woman, and his really contemptuous treatment of Ophelia and his mother, with that's classic unreliable narrator. I don't think you can say that Shakespeare is endorsing what Hamlet says. But Ophelia, Daisy Ridley gives a really appealing performance as Ophelia. The language, unfortunately, is not Shakespeare, but I understand it's really hard to write pastiche of Shakespeare, so they sort of just made everything fit together in a semi-old, but not too specific period writing style, which I appreciated. There's a terrible film called Lost in Austen that tries to tell us that Austen actually wrote her characters to speak in Shakespearean dialogue style, and that's completely wrong and stupid. So I'm glad that they didn't specify too much what the style of this dialogue was when they made up their own stuff to match with their rephrasing of Shakespeare. The direction was gorgeous in Ophelia, and I really love the music by Stephen Price. He wrote a song based on the love letter that Hamlet writes to Ophelia. Doubt thou the stars are fire, doubt thou that truth, something like that, but never doubt I love you. And Daisy Ridley, I think, sings some of it. She might do all of it, but just hearing her chanting, it's a very chanted rendition of that poem, that letter, and hearing those Shakespearean words was just such a cool thing, because it's such a great love poem, and it's very hauntingly set, and I really enjoyed that textual reference to the actual text of the play. The plot itself is altered quite a bit. They steal from Romeo and Juliet for both the secret wedding and for Ophelia faking her death, and then they steal, of course, from Twelfth Night and As You Like It for Ophelia dressing up as a man, although that felt kind of unnecessary. I feel like she could just sneak in. They don't film it in such a way that dressing up as a man felt necessary. So they could have filmed it better in that way, but as a Shakespeare nerd, I really appreciated those touches, those borrowings, those mirrorings. It was a really, really fun movie. I definitely recommend it. I hope they can get it on DVD soon, because I don't see a release date. I also rewatched Much Ado About Nothing, directed by Kenneth Branagh. I know some people really prefer the Joss Whedon directed version with Amy Acker and Alexis Denisov, and that's a very good version, but I just love the sun-drenched and romantic, weird, ahistorical version that Kenneth Branagh did with Denzel Washington as the Duke and Emma Thompson as Beatrice. Keanu Reeves, I still think, wasn't great as Don John, and I don't understand why they didn't try to get Will Smith. Maybe he wasn't available, but Will Smith and Denzel Washington would have been much more plausible to me as brothers, and Will Smith is, I think, was a better actor at that time in his career than I think Keanu's grown into it. But I think now, I think at that point, Will Smith would have been able to emote more and be more plausible. I also started listening to a podcast by the Folger Theater in Washington, D.C., which I actually did visit once. Not to see, no, I did see Shakespeare there. I saw a comedy of errors. No, Two Gentlemen of Wrong. I didn't like it very much. It was too silly for me. But I also saw Sense and Sensibility there, which was really fun, if a bit shallow. Not that Jane Austen's shallow. I just thought that the adaptation and the performance focused on style over substance. But anyway, I listened to the podcast, and they interviewed a novelist from the University of Minnesota, where I am now, not the school, but in Minnesota, Julie Schumacher, who wrote 2 novels, Dear Committee Members, which is about a English professor who writes a whole novel. He's the only point of view. He writes letters of recommendation, and that's the structure of the whole novel. And the Shakespeare Requirement's a sequel, not in letters this time. I do like an epistolary novel, but this one was a traditional novel, and it was about a 2-semester-long battle over the statement of vision, where the one Shakespeare scholar in the department refuses to get on board with the statement of vision, without which the department will fund it. And so there's all this commentary on the professionalization and the adjunct situation and faculty members and competition. And there's the evil economics department head who is just a thoroughly despicable character. And pretty much this is a satirical novel series, so everyone is fairly despicable except for one character who's a young freshman student girl who gets pregnant. She comes from a religious background, from a single mother, and she really struggles with that because she gets pregnant. I appreciated that there wasn't too much politicization of that particular plot line. I wish they'd been I went to a Christian college, and then I went to a secular college for my graduate degree, and so I know that the things she goes through and the attitude she has are realistic to people I've met. But it was a bit frustrating that her religious convictions were sort of kind of a joke. They were well-meaning, but kind of weightless and pointless. But it was really a nice experience reading these novels about my discipline of English, which also really sort of made me sad because without a commitment to beauty and the historical tradition, or what we call the canon, the English department has really become just a bunch of sort of misanthropic people who are very angry about the state of the world, but because they don't have a commitment to the traditions which form that world, they believe that politics, specifically a critical theory or Marxist-derived understanding of the world, which divides us into the binary of oppressed and oppressors, is the only way to make the world a better place. And I think that English is supposed to focus on truth and beauty, and instead of trying to divide us and encourage our tribal loyalties. I think it's supposed to bring us together and help us to understand different points of view. The movie Shadowlands, written by William Nicholson, has a great line, we read to know we're not alone. And that, to me, is the purpose of English. It's to understand we're not alone. We're not alone in the universe because we're created by God. We're not alone in our own social circle or in the wider global context, because people have different beliefs and ideas, but they also still love and are loved and desire and fail and are sinful and frailty. And it's really powerful. It's why I majored in English. It's why I got my degrees. And it just made, these 2 novels made me sad because there is no one in the novels who has that sense. The closest you get is the Shakespeare scholar, but he's just a very sad man who's lost his whole family and doesn't have anything in the future. So that's sort of my vlog on Shakespeare. I've had a really good time the last 3 months, just sort of dipping my toes and sometimes thinking more deeply about Shakespeare. And I would recommend all the things I've talked about here. Ophelia, All Is True, The Shakespeare Requirement, Kenneth Branagh's Shakespeare films. I recommend all of them, and I hope that more people will continue to love Shakespeare.